Neil Faulkner was many things: an archaeologist, a writer, a historian, a broadcaster, a teacher, and a radical political activist. On February 4th of this year, 2022, Neil Faulkner died in London at the age of 64. I had the very good opportunity to interview Neil Faulkner a number of times over the years, and they were some of my favorite interviews. And the one that stands out to me the most is when we talked about his book, A People's History of the Russian Revolution. It's the most accessible book on the Russian Revolution that I've ever read, and it was told in that typical Neil Faulkner way, from the bottom up, as it began with the throngs of women who took to the streets in St. Petersburg on International Women's Day, 1917. So in remembering Neil Faulkner, I bring you this interview that we did over the phone about his book, A People's History of the Russian Revolution. This interview is from 2017, which marked the 100th anniversary of the revolution itself. Neil Faulkner, it's my very good pleasure to welcome you to the program.
Thank you very much, Mitch.
So this is fascinating. The Russian Revolution, one could argue, and, how do you really pinpoint a particular date? But I'm going to begin with this, February 23rd, 1917. And we'll back up in a moment to the things that preceded this, but this is a fascinating date. February 23rd, 1917. It's International Women's Day. Tell me the significance.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, tell me the significance of that.
Yes, it is International Women's Day, and because it was that, there were the sort of routine calls from the left in Russia, in Petrograd, in the capital city, to mark the day in the traditional way, and there was no real expectation on the part of the left parties in Russia in 1917 that this was going to turn into the beginning of a revolution. But what happened on this particular International Women's Day in Petrograd is that crowds of working class women came out onto the streets. They took strike action and came out onto the streets, and they started moving around the working class suburbs, calling out the workers in other factories to join them, to demand a solution to the bread crisis. Because 3 years into the First World War, there was starvation on the home front in Russia. And I think the working class, the women in particular, who were trying to feed their families, had reached breaking point by February 1917.
You have this great line in your book, and I don't have it in front of me, so you'll forgive me, but it went something to the line of the likes of, when there are tears over bread, expect revolution.
Yes, absolutely. And there are these visceral descriptions from the time of women queuing in the freezing cold of that winter, sometimes for hours, in an effort to get a loaf of bread, and getting to the end of the queue, or maybe not even getting to the end of the queue, but hearing that the bread supply has run out and the shutters of the shop are going up, and then they have to go to work, and when they come back from work in the evening, they've got no bread to feed their children with. So it's an absolutely desperate crisis, and there are accounts of women bursting into tears, sometimes when they get a loaf of bread from the relief, sometimes when they fail to get a loaf and they're worried about what they're going to put on the table. Revolution is close when a loaf of bread can produce tears.
I think that's what you said. Tell me the significance of Petrograd, which formerly was St. Petersburg, and now is again.
Yes, it is. Yes, it's changed names several times, actually, Mitch. It was St. Petersburg before the outbreak of the First World War. The name was then Russianized because, of course, the Russians found themselves in conflict with the German, so it becomes Petrograd. Later on, in the Stalinist period, in the interwar period, it becomes Leningrad. It's named after the leader of the Russian Revolution, and it has, since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and the breakup of the dictatorship, the Stalinist dictatorship anyway. I think we've got a different kind of dictatorship there now, but at the breakup of the Stalinist dictatorship, the name reverted back to St. Petersburg. In 1917, it's the capital city. It's where the Tsar has his palace. It's where the center of government is. And it's a city of round about 3 million people. And it's also one of the major industrial centers of Russia at the time, with some huge engineering factories, many of them, of course, in 1917 geared to the war effort.
Let's get back to February 23rd, 1917. This, I guess, can we say this is the beginning of the revolution?
Yeah, definitely it is. And although it's interesting that at first the authorities don't realize that, and nor even do the left-wing parties, the revolutionary parties, which are still, of course, in the underground, because this is a police state. They're not operating in the open. But even after the first day, on the 23rd of February, nobody's really got the sense of where exactly is this going to go. But what happens on the second day, and it's all happening spontaneously, it's all happening from below, it's all happening at the level of the factories and the working class suburbs. On the second day, the strike resumes and it spreads further, so that by the end of the second day, 24th of February, there are twice as many people out on strike as the previous day, and then it builds further on the third day, and it begins to look extremely dangerous by the third day, and you begin to get the first major clashes between working class demonstrators and the police, and increasingly the soldiers as well, as the authorities send them onto the streets to confront the working class crowds coming into the downtown area from the working class suburbs.
And then how long does this particular event last? Is it 4 days? It comes to an end on February 27th?
5 days. 5 days of increasingly large numbers coming out on strike, so that virtually the whole of working class Petrograd is in shutdown by the fifth day. Increasingly large-scale confrontations between the crowds and the security forces, and absolutely crucially, what is happening by the fourth day is that the soldiers are refusing to fire on the crowds, and then on the fifth day, the soldiers as a whole go over to the crowds, and there's this extraordinary mingling of working class crowds, and of course soldiers who are effectively peasants in uniform. Now, these vivid descriptions of what is of the sort of almost like the microbiology of a revolution, where you get a confrontation on the street between a line of peasant soldiers, probably fed up with the war, probably fed up with the poverty in the village at home, thinking about their mothers, thinking about their sisters, thinking about their wives and their girlfriends. And what do they see in front of them? They see crowds dominated by starving working class women who could be their own relatives. And you can understand how that army disintegrates when its officers give them the order to fire into these crowds of unarmed civilians.
This is done without particular leaders.
Absolutely. No, this is what's so extraordinary about it. The February Revolution is leaderless at the level of the top, but of course it's not. These things are never leaderless at a rank and file level. Of course, there are leaders in the factories, there are leaders in the working class tenements and so on, but they're rank and file leaders. They're leaders who are sort of embedded within the mass movement. What's interesting about the February days is that there's no call from above. There's no call from the Bolsheviks, there's no call from the Mensheviks, there's no call from the Social Revolutionary Party, the three major revolutionary groupings. There's no central committee which is meeting and deciding that this is going to be the beginning of the revolution. The whole thing is welling up from below, from the people themselves.
You have this great line that I'll butcher again, so you'll forgive me, but it struck me that revolutionary parties often tend to be 3 steps ahead of the curve, when which they actually need to be is just 1 step ahead.
Yes. Yes, no, that's absolutely right. And what's also true is that sometimes revolutionary parties are behind the curve altogether. They have to be not too far ahead of it, and they also have to be not behind it. In February, they were behind it. There's no question at all. They had no sense of just how the working class in Petrograd had finally reached a kind of critical mass of anger and was ready to move into action.
Again, International Women's Day, and we said this was on February 23rd, 1917, and this is when all this begins. People might say, wait, I thought International Women's Day was on March 8th, but we're actually, Russia at this time was still using the Julian calendar.
Yes, that's right. So it's if you read the history, it's very complicated because you've got to know at the outset whether the historian is using the Julian calendar or the Gregorian calendar. What I actually do in the book, everybody has to tackle this problem who's going to talk about it. What I actually choose to do in the book is I stick with the Russian dates. So the Russians don't actually change to the Gregorian calendar until 1918. So once I'm talking about events after they've made that change, then I switch as well. But yes, the February Revolution, just to confuse everybody, took place in March, just as the October Revolution, as it's generally speaking called, took place in November.
Is there any significance in the change of calendars in 1918?
I just know. I think probably it was they were using the Julian calendar because I think it was traditional in the Russian Orthodox Church, and obviously after the Bolshevik Revolution, religious considerations mattered far less, and they wanted to get into sync with the modern world.
So, again, February 23rd to February 27th.
Yeah.
Does this go beyond Petrograd? Or just Petrograd?
Yes, it does. It's the news about the revolution breaking out in Petrograd reaches Moscow and other industrial centers very quickly. So Moscow moves into action almost immediately, and other industrial centers as well. So the thing spreads extremely quickly. It moves more slowly in relation to the army at the front, and slower still in relation to the peasants in the villages. And that's critical because the Russian working class in 1917 was a relatively small minority of the total population. The great majority of ordinary common people were, of course, peasants. And a very large proportion of those peasants had been conscripted into the army. There were something like 10 million soldiers altogether in the Russian army at this time. So what was crucial was that the revolutionary mood should spread to the soldiers at the front and also to the peasants in the villages. If it didn't, then the danger was that soldiers would be brought from the front and they would still under the orders of their officers, and they would be used to shoot down the revolutionaries in the streets, which of course is sort of what happened in 1905, because Russia had had an earlier revolution which had failed. And in that revolution in 1905, it was essentially peasants in uniform. They hadn't joined the revolution. They were still following the orders of their Tsarist officers, and they shot down the workers in the streets in Petrograd, or St. Petersburg as it was then, and Moscow.
That's known as Bloody Sunday.
Bloody Sunday is the beginning of that process. It's the beginning of that revolution. Yes, exactly.
I'll return to Bloody Sunday. A little more about this period in February 1917. How long until Tsar Nicholas II abdicates the throne?
Well, that's almost immediate. Once the Tsarist authorities have lost control in Petrograd, there are meetings between Nicholas and senior members of the Russian political and military elite, most crucially the generals, and he is told in no uncertain terms that we've lost control of the situation, and our only chance of getting it back is to put in place a new government, which really means that you're going to have to abdicate. So Nicholas is told that he has to abdicate, and he's effectively strong-armed by members of the Russian elite. And that's a pattern that we see, replicated in other revolutions. I think. I mean, a recent example, Mitch, just to make a recent comparison, is what happened in Egypt with the fall of Mubarak. He held on, if you remember, for 18 days in the face of increasingly angry and large demonstrations in Cairo, and it was actually the Egyptian generals who said to him, for us to get a grip on this situation, you're going to have to go, and we're going to have to create a new government. It's the only way we can appease the mood on the streets.
I guess Egypt is a great example, as I guess with Iran, 1979. I mean, I guess all revolutions you see similar tendencies, and I want to ask in that vein, and looking at Egypt as you did in Iran, 1979, you had for the revolution, the Revolutionary War, the movement to topple a dictator, monarchy, whatever it may be, is always diverse with people with different interests. From the right, in Egypt you had the Muslim Brotherhood, then you had democracy activists, these type of things. Was that the situation in Russia?
Yes, no, absolutely, and revolution is, I think, always for all participants extremely confusing. You tend to get an explosion of political activity, of different political groups, of political meetings, of newspapers, of leaflets, of pamphlets, of different orators putting different arguments, and so on. You get an explosion of political activity, and I think people invariably find it very difficult to get their bearings, and it tends to take time for the politics to crystallize and people to get a sense that certain leaders, certain groups, certain parties have a clear program, and I get that program and I see what they represent, and that's different from something else. And you can see that program, that process playing out in Russia between the February and the October revolutions, with the Bolsheviks at the beginning of 1917, a relatively small minority. Even as they emerge from the underground alongside other underground parties, they are a relatively small current compared with both the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries, and it will take the whole of the 8 months between February and October for the Bolsheviks to win a majority among the Russian workers and the soldiers and the sailors.
I just want to sit with the significance of what happened again in February of 1917. This was the overthrow of the Romanov monarchy, which ruled for more than 300 years. I mean, this is longer. That was older than the United States is now. I mean, that's significant. Something that it must have seemed cataclysmic almost.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, it's a 300-year-old dynasty, and it's brought down in just 5 days by a revolutionary insurrection which is led by the lowest of the low, working class women carrying the double burden of maintaining their homes and looking after their children, and also having to work, because the majority of them had to work because Russian workers were so poor. Generally speaking, it needed both parents, husband and wife, to be out at work, helping to earn a living. It is an extraordinary thing in human history that in the space of just 5 days you get this complete turnaround, and this extraordinary dynasty, as it was, brought down so very, very quickly.
We are in conversation with Neil Faulkner. He's an archaeologist, historian, activist, writer, and we are in conversation about his book, A People's History of the Russian Revolution. Neil Faulkner, now let's go back into time, skipping around the timeline a little bit here to try to get more context of how what led to the Russian Revolution. Talk to me about Russia in the 19th century. And interesting, I think an important point, Russia did not have or did not really participate in say, even the 1848 revolution that spread throughout Europe.
And I think that's symptomatic, Mitch, of how very different Russia was. Russia was very backward by comparison with the rest of Europe. Even as it comes into the 20th century, it's overwhelmingly an agricultural society dominated by peasant villages. Industries relatively underdeveloped. Infrastructure is underdeveloped. You've got limited amounts of industrial production, which actually means, of course, that when Russia finds itself embroiled in the First World War, which is a war of machines, a war of mechanization, it's at a great disadvantage compared with the great powers that have industrialized and are already way ahead. I mean, Britain leads the Industrial Revolution, and then Germany, by the late 19th century, Germany has overtaken Britain, just as the United States has, incidentally. These are the great industrializing powers. Russia is very, very late to begin this process of industrialization. And even as she begins that process, and it's really beginning in the 1880s and taking off in the 1890s, even as that process of industrialization begins, Russia is still saddled with an absolute monarchy which hasn't been reformed at all since it was created right back in the 17th century. This is a ruthless, repressive police state with an hereditary monarchy, with a reputation and a tradition of brutal suppression of popular movements, not just in Russia, but also in other parts of Europe. You've mentioned 1848. Russia doesn't participate in the 1848 revolutions. On the revolutionary side, what is true is that Russian soldiers are sent into other parts of Europe in 1848 by the Tsar to help put down the revolutionary movement in other countries.
Let's move to 1881, and you mentioned political strife really beginning in the 1880s. We had the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, and this is where we get into this term that's common with anarchists, actually, the propaganda of the deed.
Yes, and you see, there are, running right through the 19th century, there are arguments among revolutionaries, many of whom, of course, are sort of intellectuals. They're middle-class intellectuals, and sometimes they're aristocratic intellectuals, and they're debating the crisis of Tsarism. They're debating the backwardness of Russia. They're looking at what's happening in the rest of Europe, and they're thinking, we've got to make some kind of revolution to bring about these changes. But how do we do it? How do we do it in this country which is dominated by peasants and which is so dispersed and is so vast? We don't have these great big industrial cities with large concentrations of people that can act as a kind of vanguard for revolutionary change. And this debate really runs right through the 19th century. And one of the answers that is given to that question, how do we make the revolution in Russia, is that we the revolutionaries, have got to try and inspire the common people, which essentially means the peasants, inspire them to take action against the Tsar. We've got to try and, in a sense, we've got to try and kickstart a revolution by setting the example. So this is propaganda by the deed. The revolutionaries organized themselves into small, they were called at the time terrorists, and we'd call them today terrorists. Small terrorist groups carrying out attacks on leading figures in the regime. Very often it's assassinations. And you've just referred to the most spectacular success, if success it was, they had, which was the assassination of the Tsar himself in 1881. But of course it didn't work, Mitch, because it didn't move the peasantry into action. The peasantry remained completely inert, completely unmoved by propaganda of the deed.
This is an example of the revolutionaries being 3 steps ahead of the curve?
Precisely that.
Yeah.
Precisely that.
I'm going to move forward a little bit here. and I think this still gets us into what's happening in the 1880s and the 1890s, and start to talk about Vladimir Lenin. And in fact, maybe before we get to him, his brother, who was executed for his political activities.
Yes, he was, and his brother, Lenin's brother, he was a Narodnik, and the Narodniks were, or many of them were, advocates of propaganda of the deed, of terrorist violence as a way of kick-starting the revolution. And Lenin's brother was executed for his role as a Narodnik, and Lenin's relationship with this tradition is a very interesting one. I think of Lenin as a man who has part of his intellect and part of his heart in the traditional Russian revolutionary movement, and part of his intellect and part of his heart in modern European socialism. He's a mix of both, in a sense. He regards the Narodniks, these heroic intellectuals of the revolutionary underground. He regards them and their bravery and sometimes their sacrifice as models, really, for revolutionaries. He regards them as an inspiration. But at the same time, he's arguing that the strategy was wrong, that it is only the people themselves moving into action themselves that can bring down Tsarism. Only in that way can you achieve radical social change. And he shares with European socialists the sense that it's the working class concentrated in big workplaces, concentrated in big cities, who are the key revolutionary force. So that even if you're in a country which is made up predominantly of peasants, what you want is the working class in the cities and in the industrial districts to move into action, to set an example by confronting and defeating the Tsarist security forces in the cities in just the way they eventually did in February 1917, and that being your trigger for the peasant revolution. So that was the conception that Lenin had. He's a European socialist, he's a Marxist revolutionary who puts the emphasis on the working class, and at the same time he's a Russian revolutionary inspired by this heroic 19th century tradition.
Is this how Karl Marx laid it out for revolution?
No, I mean, not really. I mean, Marx was very much. He was of course a German. He was rooted in the German revolutionary movement. He was looking at a much earlier stage in the development of European civilization. The Industrial Revolution was really only.
This guy gets us near 1848 again.
Exactly right. I mean, this is Marx's revolution, if you like. He's actively involved in the events of 1848, and really Marx is an extraordinary visionary, because even though the working class across Europe and to an even greater extent across the wider world is still relatively small in terms of numbers compared with the population as a whole, even at this stage, Marx is saying the workers are the key revolutionary force. They will lead the process of revolutionary change. But what Lenin is doing is he's applying that to the specific Russian circumstances of an overwhelmingly and vast agricultural society dominated by peasant villages.
Lenin himself would be exiled, I guess, more than once, or maybe just once. You'll explain this to me, but his first exile was to Siberia.
Yes, and that was quite normal. A lot of revolutionaries, some revolutionaries were, of course, executed, but most were not. Most revolutionaries were imprisoned or sent into exile in Siberia. Conditions varied hugely. Some Tsarist prisons were appalling, but some of the exile communities, it was relatively light touch, and the revolutionaries were allowed to meet meet with each other. They were allowed to live in ordinary cottages. They received newspapers. They could write articles and so on. So the Tsarist state was very repressive. It was very intolerant of dissent, but it wasn't as brutal as some later 20th century regimes that, of course, very often, I mean, the Stalinist regime in Russia, it's worth saying now, Mitch, I mean, their attitude to dissent in the 1930s was you simply killed people, and they killed huge numbers. The Tsarist regime was not brutal in quite that way.
In that way. Well, that's interesting. Now, Lenin, did he then go? Did he go to Switzerland from Siberia, or how did he get to Switzerland?
Yes, he comes out of his period of exile, but he's not able to remain active in Russia for very long because again there's repression of underground activity. I mean, he's a marked man, of course. I mean, having served a term in Siberia, he's a marked man, so they're watching him. At a fairly early stage, Lenin goes into exile, as do an awful lot of the revolutionary leaders. And it's in exile, really, that Lenin develops his strategy, really, for building a revolutionary movement. And what it hinges on is the idea that you've got this underground network of small groups in different towns, in different industrial districts, in different suburbs of the big cities, but they're having to hide from the police. They're having to operate in difficult underground circumstances where it was difficult to maintain links between different groups. And of course, this is in a period when communications are much, much more primitive than they are now in any case.
An important point, he is not in Russia for the Russian Revolution.
No, he's not. No, when the revolution breaks out in 1917, absolutely, he's not. He is in Switzerland, and it's from there that he's created this. And he moves around a bit, but he's in Switzerland when the revolution breaks out in 1917, and it's in exile that he creates this revolutionary center, which crucially involves the production of a newspaper and the smuggling of that newspaper across the border and the distribution of that newspaper across Russia to the various revolutionary groups. Now, this is something which is going on for years in the lead up to the revolution, and what it's doing is it's creating a body of political ideas which are common to all of the various revolutionary groups, all of the various revolutionary activists that are part of this network. So you have a kind of common vision which is being shared by the Bolshevik cadre, the Bolshevik activists on the ground.
Again, we are in conversation with Neil Faulkner, archaeologist, historian, activist, writer, and we're talking about his book, A People's History of the Russian Revolution. Neil Faulkner, it could be argued there is no Russian Revolution without World War I and what happened to Russia in World War I, and also the rise of the anti-war movement during World War I in Russia.
Hugely important, the First World War, in creating this great wave of revolution, which of course isn't restricted to Russia. It starts in Russia in 1917, but we've really got a wave of revolution and radicalism which extends right across the globe in the years afterwards, going into the early 1920s. And the First World War, it is difficult for us now, so familiar with the horrors of war, the destructive nature of war in the 20th century, difficult for us to capture how it impacted upon contemporaries, because in the 19th century, wars, generally speaking, were fought by professional soldiers, relatively small armies, at a great distance, and it didn't impact significantly on the home front. The First World War between 1914 and 1918 absolutely tears societies apart. In particular, it tears apart European society, visiting upon it unprecedented levels of killing, of mutilation, and of impoverishment, as all of the resources of society flow into the war effort, and the result is starvation and disease on the home front. This is, in a sense, this is a conflict that rips the heart and soul out of Europe and brings to an end that period of optimism about the future, which I think had existed up until 1914.
And the anti-war movement in Russia, tell me about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, Lenin and the Bolsheviks are very clear about the war. They are, it's worth saying, Mitch, a minority current in the European socialist movement as a whole. Most European socialists in 1914 lined up with their own rulers and supported their own country's war efforts. Now, Lenin was appalled when the European socialist leaders did this, and he was absolutely clear right from the very first day of the war that it was an imperialist war. It was a war between the rulers of the nation states on behalf of the big banks and the big corporations, and it was all about empire, and it was all about a redivision of the world, and it was all about profit. And he said that workers in uniform and peasants in uniform have no interest in killing one another on the battlefields of Europe. So he said, let us turn the imperialist war into a civil war, by which he meant a war of the people against their own rulers.
And this is when he writes the famous and influential essay, Imperialism. What's the explanation that World War I? Can you dive into that? Why he would say, and the Bolsheviks said, that this was a war for capitalism?
His position was quite simply that what was happening here was that the different imperial powers, the European imperial powers, were competing with each other for access to raw materials and markets, essentially investment outlets inside Europe and in the wider world. And the only possible outcome, he argued, is that one bloc, either the Central Powers or the Entente Powers, one bloc or the other would come out victorious, and the only effect of that is that the victorious powers would grab the colonies, they'd grab the markets, they'd grab the raw materials of the defeated powers, and it wouldn't benefit ordinary working people, whether they were in a defeated country or a victor country, one bit. And of course he's right. He's right, because if you look at what happens in Britain, say, now Britain is on the victorious side in the First World War. What happens to the soldiers when they're demobilized at the end of the war in 1918? They go back to unemployment and they go back to the slums. There is no benefit to ordinary working people from the fact that Britain has emerged victorious from the war.
Yeah, Lenin's not alone in this thought. Even here in the United States, there were anti-imperialists, people like Mark Twain or John Reed, who also saw it as a war for capitalism. Getting back to the analogy of Egypt or other revolutions in which we see similar patterns, after you topple the monarchy, as in Russia, or a dictator, as in Egypt, now there's a struggle for power between all the different groups that it was necessary to work together to topple the leader or the monarchy. Talk to me what happened after the toppling of the Tsar. You have a provincial government. What does it look like in the days after the month of February 1917?
I think what you've got two things happening. First of all, you've got an argument begins about what kind of Russia are we going to create? Are we going to create a liberal parliamentary democracy, or is this a socialist revolution that is going to bring about major changes in the economic organization and the distribution of wealth across society? You've got that debate happening. And at the same time, you've got two different rival power structures. You've got the provisional government, which is the replacement for the Tsarist government, and it's members of the provisional government who are arguing that what we need to do is to move towards a liberal parliamentary democracy.
Is this the creation of the Duma?
Well, the Duma has an existence which goes right back to the 1905 revolution, and it's continued to exist right up to 1917. And actually, a shadowy existence continues for the Duma through 1917. But no, it's not the basis of the provisional government. The provisional government is effectively self-appointed leading politicians of the Cadet Party, which is the Conservative Party, the Liberal Conservative Party, but also other more left-wing parties are also increasingly represented in the provisional government as its composition changes in the course of 1917. But the provisional government is challenged by another centre of power, and that centre of power is the Soviets. And what are the Soviets? They are essentially organs of mass participatory democracy, where in every workplace, in every district, sometimes in every tenement block, and increasingly also in the regiments of the army and eventually in the villages, you get people coming together in local assemblies, local meetings, where they decide together what their policy is going to be. Now, what happens is that as this argument unfolds in 1917 between those who are saying, no, we're going to create a liberal parliamentary democracy, and those who are saying we want something much more radical, that confrontation takes the form of a confrontation between a more conservative provisional government and an increasingly radical Soviet system, which is this network of participatory assemblies.
We know how that turns out, but how did the Soviet form of government win the day?
I think it wins the day because what's happening is these two forces, the provisional government arguing for something much more conservative, the Soviets increasingly demanding something much more radical. Both of these forces are competing for the allegiance of the people, the workers, the soldiers, the sailors, and the peasants. And the question becomes, in this situation where you have, and the way in which the revolutionary leaders, Lenin and Trotsky, described it is they said this is dual power. This is a situation where we don't have one government, we don't have one state, we have two, as it were, parallel governments and states side by side. And in this situation, people have to decide who they're going to follow, where there's a direct conflict. Now, what's happening is that the Soviets are able to represent much more immediately the aspirations of the ordinary working people. And within the Soviets, the party that is most clear in articulating those demands is the Bolshevik Party. And it's summed up in that one of history's most famous political slogans, which is peace, bread, land. The Bolsheviks sum it up as peace, bread, land. We want redistribution of wealth so that we can feed the people and they can have their material needs satisfied. We want peace because we want an end to the slaughter, and the peasants want the land. This is a program that appeals to the working people, it appeals to the peasants in the villages, it appeals to the soldiers at the front, and it's very simple, it's very easy to understand, and that's what the provisional government is resisting.
There is a counter-revolutionary attempt.
There is indeed, yes. In August 1917, a Russian general, Kornilov, becomes the focus of an attempted coup. They move troops towards Petrograd, And the position of the Bolsheviks within the Soviets is very interesting. What the Bolsheviks say, although the provisional government has been cracking down on the revolutionary movement, some of the Bolshevik leaders have actually been imprisoned by the provisional government. Despite that, what the Bolsheviks say in this crisis is that we have to defend the provisional government, we have to defend revolutionary Petrograd against the attempt by a right-wing general to bring about a counter-revolution, because if that happens, if the soldiers under Kornilov get into Petrograd, the revolution will be drowned in blood. And so they mobilize their supporters, the revolutionary soldiers, the revolutionary sailors, the Red Guards in the factories. They mobilize them, and they send their people out to fraternize with the soldiers of Kornilov. And what's interesting about the whole coup attempt is that it dissolves without any fighting. It's dissolved by the political message being carried by those who've already been won to the revolutionary movement, carrying that message to those who are being, they say, misled by your officers, because in actual fact your officers do not represent you. You should join the revolutionary movement as we have done.
Neil Faulkner, I was listening to a BBC documentary on the Russian Revolution recently, and they characterize what happened after the revolution in the days that would follow February 1917 is that, and once you got power into the hands of people like Lenin and Trotsky, Leon Trotsky, that things were still so chaotic that they had to bring an autocratic form of government to Russia. That's not your take, is it?
No, I mean, I think, you see, it's a grotesque oversimplification of something which is a process, and you have to understand that it's a process. Where I agree is this: I think the Russian Revolution was defeated. I think it was crushed by counter-revolution. But the counter-revolution didn't take the form of a czarist general. The counter-revolution took the form of a bureaucratic dictator who constructed a totalitarian dictatorship and then smashed the revolutionary movement, destroyed the Bolshevik Party, destroyed the Soviets, incarcerated huge numbers of people, killed huge numbers of people, drowned the revolution in blood. This is the work of Stalin in the late 1920s and through into the 1930s. Now, that's the end of a process. It's a process which begins very early in the development of the revolution after the seizure of power, and it happens for this basic reason, or these basic reasons. Russia is extremely backward and extremely impoverished, and there's desperate shortage and desperate scarcity. That's made much worse by the fact that Russia is almost immediately invaded by foreign armies trying to put down the revolution, and is also under attack by counter-revolutionary armies, white armies, which are being raised in the more remote parts of Russia. So the revolution is absolutely fighting for its life. And I think as it fights for its life in these desperate historical circumstances, it has to adopt increasingly authoritarian top-down methods. And I'm afraid at the end of the Civil War, the devastation is so great, Russia is so weak, the country is so prostrate, that what you end up with is a situation where really the only force that's left standing is the party-state bureaucracy, which has emerged to try and hold the revolution together in these extremely difficult circumstances. And that's the germ cell, if you like, of what becomes Stalinism. But the authoritarians are not Lenin and Trotsky. For them, this was tragedy. This was the crushing of their hopes for a democratic revolution and a socialist transformation of Russia and the wider world. They understood this as a tragic process. They weren't the willing agents of it. Crucial distinction, I think, that we have to make.
Neil Faulkner, we could easily go another hour in this conversation. At least I could. You're doing all the work, of course, but unfortunately, we are out of time. But maybe we could take up this conversation another time in the future. But nonetheless, I have enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you greatly.
I've enjoyed it too. Thanks very much indeed, Mitch.
Again, Neil Faulkner has been our guest, and he is the author of the book, A People's History of the Russian Revolution.